All right. Thanks, everyone, for joining us for our latest Program on Extremism research webinar. Thanks for joining us all online via YouTube or other platforms. My name is Alexander Meleagrou-Hitchens. I'm the Research Director at the Program on Extremism. I'm also the author or co-author of the report and the research we'll be discussing today. The report, The Age of Incoherence, Understanding Mixed and Unclear Ideology Extremism. I co-authored it with Mustafa Ayad, who's the other panelist here with us, who is an executive director at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. And we're also joined as a discussant by Megan Conroy, who's a U.S. research fellow at the Atlantic Council. And also, some of you may know her for her work on the January 6th committee, which would be very, very relevant to our discussions here. Just a quick point for the audience. If you have questions, there's a Q&A option at the bottom of your Zoom page. Feel free to enter questions into that pane throughout the talk, throughout anyone's presentations. You'll be able to just put your questions in and we'll go through them later. So you don't have to wait till the end to enter your questions. I'll be acting as sort of chair and presenter because I was a co-author on the report. So I'll start with me just to quickly give an overview of the kind of purpose, inspiration behind the report, and a little bit of the findings of the section I looked at specifically, and then we'll move on to Mustafa and Megan. So obviously, I guess one of the things that you have to note is that the kind of a concept of mixed ideology, mixed unclear, is a bit of a buzzword in the field at the moment. Terrorism studies, radicalization, extremism studies, it's something that's discussed a lot, both by researchers and analysts, but also by governments, right? So it's something that a number of the governments kind of, or states that are at the forefront of kind of counter-extremism work are using it in their official documents, using it as a term. Probably one of the first times we saw it come up was when the then director of the FBI referred to kind of referred to it as salad bar extremism in one of his presentations. I think it was an official report he gave, I believe, to a committee. And sort of since then, it's come up a lot in the UK. It's in the prevent strategy. That's the CVE strategy of the UK. It's used specifically as a category of extremism. I believe also in New Zealand, it's also an official category. So it's something that is discussed a lot. Some controversy around it, whether or not it has any real meaning, whether or not it's being used to cover up other controversies that states don't want to deal with. There are obviously criticisms of it. And our kind of idea was to try to begin to offer some level of what we thought would be some sort of conceptual clarity to this term. What does it mean? What does it not mean? And this is kind of our attempt to begin that discussion. So certainly not the final word on it. And very open, of course, to any critiques or feedback from the audience on that, or outside of this venue. Because one of the things that firstly I kind of noticed, and when I was discussing it early on with Mustafa, was it can be a kind of misused sometimes, or misunderstood. One of the classic examples, which many of you may have seen, is this pointing to the concept of eco-fascism, right, as being sort of an example of so-called mixing of different ideologies, right? Mixing of, in this case, what some may consider to be kind of traditionally leftist concerns with the environment and kind of fascism from the right. For a lot of people, those two things just don't mix, right? So this kind of got a lot of attention, particularly after Brenton Tarrant's attack in New Zealand, in Christchurch. His manifesto referred to himself as an eco-fascist. Since then, we've had at least two other people inspired by him, Patrick Crucis and Peyton Gendron, the El Paso and Buffalo shooters, respectively, both as well in their work describing themselves eco-fascists. And it's been jumped on by some people as an example of mixed ideology. Or this mixing of ideologies. And one of the things we kind of clarify at the start is that that's a bit of a misunderstanding, that actually concern for the environment has been sort of central to fascist thought really for a very long time, certainly from the time of the Nazis. There's a lot we can go into about that, but really it's kind of this belief about a number of things, including that one's ethnicity is very closely tied to the soil upon which they live, and that needs to be respected. A belief in the kind of natural order needing to be reflected in kind of human society, and so things like survival of the fittest, the kind of brutal physical approach to the sort of physical strengths of the individual being very important in their survival and their kind of value. So there's plenty to be said about that, but the point being that this is kind of one of the reasons we thought we'd have a go at discussing this, is that we wanted to kind of help at least help slightly demystify it. And there's two things that we decided to focus on this. There's other angles, absolutely. The two that we saw the most prevalent, both online and in terms of it becoming sort of manifesting itself in the real world, was what Mustafa looks at, which is the mixing of various types of Islamists or other type of kind of right-wing conservative Islamic groups with kind of American white supremacists online. It's both the kind of linguistic overlap and aesthetic overlap and ideological. And we've seen some of that actually play out in the real world, not with thankfully any major attacks, but some kind of slightly more beginner attempts. And I'll leave more of that to Mustafa to discuss in his section. But what I'll look at a little bit is this kind of the role of conspiracy theory. So this is the other part of the mixed unclear ideology discussion we have, which is the mixed part. The most relevant we thought was the mixing of these two quite overlapping movements in the white supremacist and the jihadist movement. But the unclear part sort of comes partly from the conspiracy theory side. So this, what I kind of discuss is the role it appears conspiracy theories are now playing in motivating either acts of terrorism or sort of illegal extremist activity in a way that perhaps they hadn't been doing at this scale before. And this is kind of a relevant thing, both for analysts, but also policymakers, is can we consider the conspiracy theory alone as a driver and motivation for terrorism and violence? And that is a conspiracy theory really that I don't believe in any of these cases, including QAnon, has any kind of clear or coherent ideology, and certainly not a clear or coherent political project or program that's set out. Really so our kind of traditional understanding of what drives terrorism, which is, yes, often a conspiracy theory can be this kind of central force of an ideology. Of course, the jihad movement, the war on Islam, the white supremacist, violent white supremacist movement, the Great Replacement. So those are the kind of two key conspiracy theories that act as the kind of centrifugal forces for the ideology of these two groups. But there's more to it, right? They have a very clear political program in place. They have a very clear vision for what they want instead. That can't be said about QAnon types or other types of conspiracy theorists, I believe. I mean, that's a debate, but my position is that they don't have that. So all they're really offering, the conspiracy theories only really offer this kind of diagnostic component, which is what's wrong, who's to blame. That's what all the other ones do too, but they also offer, what do we do about it? How do we motivate people? The conspiracy theory just does that diagnostic part. It just points the finger and develops a kind of understanding of the problem. But that seems to be doing enough in a way that wasn't considered to be in the past to motivate people to commit either, again, acts of terrorism, or we also look at kind of illegal activity, sort of extremist illegal activity. So it differs in one sense what we understand to be the motivation for terrorism, which is some type of clear political, or at least political program and goal. Also, the attacks themselves kind of seem to have a slightly different purpose for what, again, we traditionally understand to be a terrorist attack motivation. So if we were to use the term propaganda of the deed as being really what terrorism is, which is essentially the act of violence itself, is really a symbolic attempt to gain attention. It's another act. It's just another form of propaganda, obviously the most effective, arguably. It is symbolic. It's sending a message. And it is an act of mostly of propaganda. So the target itself doesn't necessarily matter as much as the message that comes out from it. Whereas if you think of the kind of conspiracy theory, pure conspiracy theory driven acts of violence, so the kind of where we begin the story is pretty much the Pizzagate shooting. In here you have people, and then you've had other ones since, Eduardo Moreno trying to drive his train into a ship that he thought was a kind of COVID hospital ship, where it wasn't. And if you look at the kind of motivations of these people when they're asked why they did it, it was really specifically to actually do something about the problem. It was like, I'm going to fix this, right? This attack, it has a utilitarian sort of a motive to it. It is, I'm going to go save those kids, or I'm going to go and uncover this conspiracy by doing this. That's not really what terrorist attacks generally, we understand them as we understand them right now, or at least the literature understands them, intend to do. So here it's kind of a more direct act, looking to kind of achieve very specific goals. And so those are things that we argue kind of need to be considered both by analysts, but also by sort of authorities, counterterrorism authorities, especially, and CVE, and also in CVE work to kind of take conspiracy theories alone more seriously, which I think we are partly seeing. We look specifically at the US, and it's kind of a very early and exploratory study. We did develop a data set on both the Islamist and extreme right overlap, but also for the conspiracy theory, violence, and extremism. The three key categories that I identified were people driven by some type of belief in the child abuse rings, underground child abuse rings that are overseen by the elite. Of course, famous kind of where QAnon kind of came out of, the inspiration for Pizzagate. There's kind of an understandably effective conspiracy theory. It touches on kind of key things like children being targeted. It opens up the kind of attraction of that idea of extreme ideas to a very wide pool of people, wider than, say, extreme right ideas or jihadist ideas would. It's very rooted, the threat to children by some type of nefarious, usually Satanist. So there's also usually a religious component here. That kind of satanic panic concept is not new. So that's the other thing to keep in mind here. QAnon and all it's really just the latest in kind of far right American Christian moral panic about children being threatened by kind of not the real threats they face, but the kind of mystical, made up spiritual ones. And this is, you can go back decades to see very similar, if not as widespread or extreme versions of this kind of satanic threat to children. So it has to be also couched in this wider understanding of the role of certain types of evangelical Christianity in America, and its role in its mainstream politics, as well as its role in society, and its role in kind of cooking up scare stories around children particularly. So that, the fact that that's probably the most popular conspiracy theory that drives illegal or extreme activity in the US isn't a surprise, one, because of the nature of it, but two, because it is rooted in American culture and history for really quite some time. The second most popular that we had in our data set, at least in terms of a driver, was the 2020 stolen election narrative. Of course, we had January 6th was, the best example. We don't include January 6th data in this. This is kind of lone actor type rather than that kind of mass event that January 6th was. There's probably an argument to say we could have included it in the stats, but we didn't. And the third most popular, again, probably not surprisingly, has been COVID and sort of vaccine related. The thing about particularly the 2020 election, the COVID stuff, is that it has, of course, died down as those issues have died down. Another thing to keep in mind then is, what's going on in terms of people's screens, in terms of the media, is going to have a big impact on how long a conspiracy theory can go on for and survive and continue to be attractive. So I'll leave it at that. I mean, the kind of key point really being is we should consider conspiracy theories as we should at least think about considering conspiracy theories as a standalone category when it comes to the motivation for terrorism. In terms of the kind of not predicting, but understanding the targeting, it's going to be different. It's going to be more utilitarian, less symbolic. And, to understand the allure of conspiracy theories in America, it's, I think, important to understand the history of the United States, and also particularly the history of evangelical Christianity in politics. And I think there's a lot to be said for it. I'm not the only person to point this out, of course. This isn't the first study to suggest this needs to be looked at. but it is something that isn't touched on enough, particularly officially. And I would like to see that a bit more. But I'll leave it at that. We'll go on to Mustafa now for his side of the analysis, and then Megan. I think Mustafa also has a slideshow. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. First of all, I just want to thank George Washington University Program on Extremism for hosting this, and of course the panelists, Megan, Alex, yourself. Also, just sort of a shout out to both of you. To begin with, I just want to start on my piece of the pie, which was essentially, and my role in regards to this paper was essentially looking at sort of this shifting sort of aesthetics, content, and sort of communities, fringe communities that were coming out that were considered quote unquote salad bar extremism, hybridized, however you would like to put it, and trying to put a more sort of definitional framework around what we were seeing around a sort of shift in aesthetics, content, and ideology in some ways. But first, before you begin, you have to look at sort of the shifting sort of landscape around radicalization and the internet in the United States and also beyond, but primarily in the US. When you're looking at people under 30 in the US, according to the PIRUS data set, the number of radicalized people with no formal allegiance or ties to recognized extremist or terrorist groups has jumped about 311% in the past 10 years as compared to the past 5 decades. So there's a shift that's taking place there, at least from what the data is telling us based on the PIRUS database. Similarly, and this could go probably more towards the internet itself, but since 2010 and 2020, the internet has played a primary role in the radicalization process for those under 30 and has jumped about 413% as the previous decade. So you have these two sort of simultaneous things happening that are essentially shifting the way that these communities operate online, how they define themselves, how they pilfer from each other in a number of ways, and essentially how they're made up. So to do this, while real-world cases may seem like outliers in sort of terrorism-linked investigations nationally, it is indicative of a larger trend where the two spheres of REMV and Islamism are becoming increasingly indistinguishable in some sense. Requires understanding the content continuum in the extremist milieux that have long existed online. So there are a number of sort of, I would say, factors that play into why the content and aesthetics of these two desperate communities, if you will, are sort of beginning to converge. And you can go back to 2016, the Great Meme War. You can go back to things that are related to Gamergate, for instance. You can also tie this into the sort of rise of mass casualty attackers, school shooters, if you will, and how that is shaping the content of desperate groups online. So to do this, we were looking at reviewed court records of some indicative case studies, not all the case studies that we could bring in into this. Analyzed some 9,000 memes and meme videos from Facebook, Instagram, Reddit, and Twitter, as well as messaging-based applications such as Telegram and the closed platform Discord, gaming adjacent, collected between 2020 and 2022. And we classified that content into a framework based on idiosyncratic terrorism, first developed by Jesse Norris in 2020, which I'll discuss a bit more further, and why I particularly gravitated towards Jesse's or Dr. Norris's classification system. So first, in terms of case studies, we looked at several. I'm just going to highlight 3 here. Omar al-Khattoul, which we could classify as the quote unquote the LARPer. If you look at his case in 2021, and he was arrested for making threats to synagogues. In 2021, he tells an audience on a Telegram chat that he's currently in an Iran enjoyer phase, end quote, but has also become a Taliban supporter and Iran supporter at the same time, end quote. And these are direct quotes taken from the Telegram chat in public records. In November 2022, and this was in late 2021, he creates a manifesto written in the past tense titled "When Swords Collide" and claims he has committed, quote unquote, an attack on the Jews. And This suggests to prosecutors as well as investigators that he was plotting an attack of some kind on a synagogue, and sort of matches up with his activities offline. And then in December 2022 through February 2023, he says he's moved on to Al-Qaeda and believes that the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria are Khawarij or outsiders. And in March 2023, he fully supports ISIS and tells an audience on Discord and Telegram. He similarly, at the same time, tells the same audience on Discord and Telegram he's LARPing as a quote-unquote jihadi. He creates a video montage of Dylan Roof, the neo-Nazi perpetrator of the heinous attack on an African-American church in South Carolina that resulted in the deaths of 9 people. And he believed the churchgoers killed in the attack perpetrated by Roof were Christcucks, which is a term that is directly taken from Chan culture, which we'll talk about a little bit later, and that Muslims in the West should specifically learn from Roof. And so what you can see here is just the speed at which someone is radicalizing, the sort of shifts in the sort of ideological space that he is at, and then simultaneously the sort of the interplay between what's online and what's in the real world is not the same, even though there are obviously moves offline that are taking place where he's sort of parceling out his online activity versus his offline. And you can kind of see that very clearly here. Next are some older cases that Alex also similarly dredged up and we went into sort of background on. Emerson Bulgogi, whose father introduces him to Nazism as a child, and mother says he really became interested in Nazism in 2001. He was an administrator of an English language Salafi jihadist forum, posts things like a quote unquote a successful lone wolf attack when it kills 1 or 2 or 3 or kuffars better than an unsuccessful massive attack, which also results in your own arrest. And we've seen that sort of narrative in neo-Nazi accelerationist circles as well in the later half in the 2020s. Under a pseudonym, he asked jihadist forums to use firearms, explosives, propane tanks, sort of conduct your own DIY style attack Jewish schools, day centers. Again, a part and parcel of all of these communities is fervent anti-Semitism, hatred for LGBTQ plus communities, and similarly a desire to conduct as much wanton violence as possible. And he repeatedly tells his brother he wants to die as a martyr and take care of others with him. And his friends claim that a white supremacist group called him and asked that he lead a Nazi movement. So you have this sort of intermingling between the two in this specific case. And the same with Nicholas Young, where you have a District of Columbia Metro Transit officer, has a tattoo of a German eagle on his neck and an SS logo on his arm, collected Nazi memorabilia. He dressed as Jihadi John with a fake beard and a hostage for Halloween. He bookmarked, investigators later found, 36 selfie jihadists and Nazi sites on his own computer, was an avid video game player. He set up an account on Facebook in the name of a Warhammer 40,000 character and shared photographs of the former Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Mohammed Amin al-Husseini, meeting with Adolf Hitler, saluting Nazi troops, and he denied terrorist links and claimed to have traveled to Libya twice to topple Gaddafi. So there is background of actual cases, and of course there are others that we can get into more recently that are linked to the Order of the Nine Angles and others that have sort of had this sort of ideological interplay for a while. So we know that it's happening offline. What does it look like online, and how is it metastasized? So when we looked online, we really wanted to get away from this. Look, we're referring to all of this stuff as salad bar extremism, mixed and unclear, unstable ideologies, reciprocal radicalization, ideologically fluid, hybrid ideologies, composite violent extremism. Really what I was looking at, and in my estimation, I'm glad, I will gladly argue this with others and have a good back and forth, is that we're thinking about idiosyncratic terrorism. So what is idiosyncratic terrorism? Well, there's 4 dimensions to it. It was developed by Jesse Norris in 2020. And idiosyncratic terrorism is essentially idiosyncratic ideologies, tactics, strategic thinking, and motives. And so part of that is it's great. That encapsulates what I'm seeing online through this data set. But at the same time, missing from this discussion was sort of content and the role of idiosyncratic content as a part of tactics and or strategic thinking. So content plays a central role in defining and even creating new idiosyncratic ideologies, especially online. And we've seen this over the years and how it shifts. You have fringe groups that have sub-fringe groups that are a part of them. And we'll talk about this in a minute. And so from there, what we were able to sort of identify are several support communities from our data set that could be traditionally defined as neo-Nazis, which will be broken down according to Nazi Salafi, Nazi Shia distinctions. But we also saw Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, or Iran-backed militia hubs that have intra-group idiosyncrasies, which ultimately influence the development of their communities, their ideologies, their tactics, strategic thinking, and motives. And we define these groups of supporters as neo-Nazi Salafis, neo-Nazi Shia, Chan Iran-backed militias, alt-Islamic State, and alt-Qaeda to create a distinction between them and others that inhabit the same ideological ambit. This was previously, and I had previously referred to this in another paper, as the quote-unquote alt-jihad. This grouping of alt-jihadists is actually a microcosm of multiple fringe communities, often at odds with one another, united in their own use of idiosyncratic terrorist content. They're feeding off of one another. And so what does this content look like? Well, in terms of breakdown, when we sort of tried to classify it, a lot of this from what we had in our data set, and we're talking about 9,000 memes, 9,000 memes and videos, meme style videos. It included predominantly alt-Islamic State content. However, this was closely followed by Chan Iran-backed militias, neo-Nazi Shia, Al-Qaeda, and neo-Nazi Salafis. What are these communities and how did they come about? Well, these online communities are primarily spread across Telegram. They're also frequently using closed platforms such as Discord to share content. Most notably, and similar to claims by Al-Qatul, who I mentioned in the case study section, these online communities often claim that they're in fact LARPing to obfuscate their true ideological leanings and motives. And we found that idiosyncratic commonalities run through all these communities, namely the appropriation of Chan culture's aesthetics and language. So as you can see here, here's one from a Chan-backed Iran militia group that is supportive of Hezbollah and supportive of Russia and its aims and invasion of Ukraine, where you have Sergei Lavrov saying that Hitler has Jewish blood, and then more than them pouncing on it and claiming that he's speaking facts. And so the adoption of the same aesthetic and language by ideologically different groups such as Rembi's and Islamists is idiosyncratic in and of itself. It's also emblematic of two central environmental factors: the global spread of Chan culture, so the sort of aesthetic language that came out of 4chan and other forums, 8chan, you name it, and the global spread and sort of a younger generation of supporters for a range of different extremist groups. We're having a shift in terms of demographics in regards to a support, and what that sort of shift comes is essentially a shift in the content, aesthetics, and language. And so previous research has highlighted to some extent, and this is getting into neo-Nazi Salafists or Salafist National Socialists. Previous research has highlighted the extent to which there is a crossover between these communities. While self-professed neo-Nazi Salafis may draw partially on the ideological precepts of the Order of Nine Angles, which is O9A, they similarly have, which is an occultist neo-Nazi accelerationist group, they similarly have a deep animus towards O9A, despite sharing some of its founding doctrine. And its members have lost Telegram-based raids on O9A Telegram channels. So you actually have a sort of distinction there that highlights a dynamic. And this dynamic indicates that neo-Nazi Salafis may fall into the mixed ideological space. However, there are fringe groups that are rejecting sort of within this spacing, the traditional poles of mixed ideological trailblazers, read O9A, and are developing their own idiosyncratic doctrine, content, narratives. And so you have groups on Telegram that are set up as national Salafist National Socialists that are based in Germany, that are also based in the US, that are functioning and trying to develop their own political platform. This includes things such as the Red Caliphate. Now, neo-Nazi Shias. Now, this exists. Like neo-Nazi Salafis, the neo-Nazi Shia communities have developed sort of an idiosyncratic doctrine that goes beyond Nazi Germany and includes influences from the Iranian Sumka party. The Sumka party is the National Socialist Workers' Party founded in Iran and allegedly supported by the CIA. Its philosophy views Persians as the original Aryans. And by claiming to be historically linked, the neo-Nazi Shia communities use that legacy of the Third Reich to fawn over ideologues such as Hitler, Goebbels, and Himmler on popular platforms such as Facebook or YouTube, and use Telegram to organize and build out communities. Very distinct from the other sort of Islamist-based neo-Nazi communities that we saw that have that affinity. Similarly, Chan Iran-backed militias. So these supporters, typically supportive of Hezbollah or other groups operating in Iran, in Iraq, and the Islamic Republic of Iran, have developed their own ecosystem of alt-right infused aesthetics that draw on racist tropes of Arabs, as well as sectarian tropes of Sunnism, often attacking Salafis due to the latter. So there's a lot of sort of inter-fight, sort of inter-conflict dynamics there. Part and parcel of this community is a fervent support for Syrian President Bashar al-Assad because he has outlasted his detractors. One of the key content-based idiosyncrasies of this community is the likening of Sunnis to Jews based on fervent anti-Semitism, but also anti-Arab sentiment and recent geopolitical events that include the diplomatic thaw and economic ties forged between Gulf states and Israel. Other terrorist idiosyncrasies stem from the use of aesthetics and areas of this community that tie into regional geopolitics linked to Iran and Iran-backed militias, with Chan culture tropes around quote-unquote Sunni cucks and support for Hitler for orchestrating the Holocaust. So you're seeing a dynamic there that is similarly defining this community from others. And then last but not least, and I've lumped them together, alt-Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. And these are, as previous research that we've led into Gen Z Salafi communities indicated, support for the Islamic State in these digital ecosystems is rife with contradictions, all right? So Islamic State's violence was applauded by these alt-Islamic State supporters, but the ideological precepts were often rejected, highlighting a sort of internal idiosyncrasy that exists within these communities. So again, we're seeing idiosyncrasies within an idiosyncratic community that is using far-right or extreme right aesthetics and Chan culture to sort of define itself online. Support for Al-Qaeda in the data set was less of an alignment with the precepts of ideological components central to the group and more about their ideologue. So it's ideologue based rather than sort of an ideology. So Osama bin Laden, Anwar al-Awlaki, what ultimately differentiated Al-Qaeda from traditional supporters of Al-Qaeda online was its use of Rembi aesthetics. So Al-Qaeda content producers do their focus on ideologues rather than group message or operations, were more likely to get widespread support from other Salafist jihadist channels by mixing their content and discourse with that of Rembi's. So you bringing in Hitler, bringing in other sort of notable Chan characters, such as Pepe the Frog, who obviously has a history before he was sort of reappropriated by the far and extreme right and alt-right. And that sort of defines this community. And with that, I'm going to close on this section. However, it's important to note that as long as we develop these sort of broad-based sort of definitions of communities or try to lump them, we need better classification systems for what we are seeing online. And we need to be able to tell people, yes, this is a community that exists. Here are its basic ideological precepts. Here's how its content and its ideology is promoted. Because ultimately, if we're going to focus on degrading or disrupting these communities, we need to understand them first.
Thanks, Mustafa. Really useful. And just before I go to Megan, just to pick up on two things that you mentioned. I think one, in terms of just the role of the internet, right, that you talk about, and of course you know, it's kind of the cliche at this point to keep talking about the role. Of course, it has a role, but you know, what we note as well in the report is that it's actually there's a kind of, it's the move away from formal group affiliation to kind of more diluted type of online involvement. You know, so the internet has allowed for the move away from the formal groups, right? It's allowed a space for extremists to operate without needing formal groups. But this also connects us directly to the mixing question, which is, you know, when you had formal group affiliation, when you know, formal groups generally, you were quite good at policing their members, what they believed, who they affiliated with, the roots of their beliefs, and all this. Without that policing going on anymore, you're actually finding that these different types of extremists who are drawn to certain different types of extremism are in some cases finding a lot more in common with people they otherwise wouldn't have been able to hear from because of that, the more formal kind of policing component, sort of leadership policing. So, and that takes me to the second point, which is that this overlap that you're talking about between different types of Islamists, Salafis, and sort of right-wing Islamic groups and the extreme white supremacist types, it's not some random thing, right? It's not, and this is some of the discourse around it kind of suggests it's this kind of crazy pick and choose salad bar situation where it's just, you know, whatever's going on the day, that person's picking up and justifying their violence with. No, there's more logic to it than that. You know, it's not a coincidence that these two groups, the two most preeminent non-state, you know, extreme movements today, I would say, are finding common cause. It's not a coincidence. In fact, they're both, you know, and I've gone on about this a lot, so apologies to those of you who attend these POE events a lot, because you've heard this from me many times, Mustafa has as well, is that you're talking about two groups who essentially have very, very similar concerns and very, very similar views about why their in-group is struggling. You know, they're both surveying their societies and have kind of decided and that the biggest problems that they have are kind of the influx of liberal thought, certainly of certain postmodern, but also pre-postmodern liberal thought, and particularly things like pluralism, sexual freedom, and they are viewing their societies in a kind of moral decline. As a result of these essentially liberal leftist ideas. And of course, they both view the hidden hand of Jewish power as being absolutely central to this kind of moral, ethical decline of their in-group, intentional as well, you know, an intentional attempt to morally deprave their in-group, be it, you know, whites, be it Muslims. And the people doing this targeting are basically the same. As far as these two are concerned, so they have a very similar view, and then of course they have different visions for how this all turns out. But for now, in this phase they're in, which is the kind of rebellion phase, they have very little to disagree on. So anyway, sorry to cut into your well, not cutting into your time. Actually, Megan, you have plenty. You can take 15 minutes if you need it. Go ahead. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That actually was a perfect segue into my presentation, which I know, Alex, you don't know what I'm about to say, but it built off of that. So great spiel.
I didn't need to
Yeah, so I just want to say thank you all for inviting me to speak today. I'll just jump right in. Of course, as Alex said, I didn't necessarily contribute to the report that my fellow panelists wrote. I'm just the personality hire here. But in all seriousness, day in and day out for years now, I've been monitoring both on and offline spaces that extremists occupy. And when I say extremists, I'm not just talking about swastika flag toting members of the Blood Tribe or a Proud Boy who engaged in seditious conspiracy. I'm talking about anyone who genuinely believes that their in-group success is reliant upon hostile action against an outgroup, to borrow from J.M. Berger's definition of extremism in his book. So I tend to look at the most seemingly banal or everyday manifestations of extremism because I think that's the most kind of nefarious and admittedly nebulous threat that we face. And so when I do this online monitoring, I'm looking at the ways in which narratives move throughout the broader information ecosystem, a term that you've already heard on this panel today. I think it's a really helpful approach to view kind of the way that we are just bombarded with information day in and day out. And I look at aesthetics and memes and symbols and other iconography in addition to narratives. I observe migration of groups and movements and individuals from platform to platform and how those actors use various platforms' affordances and functionalities and content moderation policies to their benefit, and how they toe the line of those content moderation policies. And so I like to think I know what people are saying online and how that also manifests in offline spaces and vice versa. It's very multi-directional flow of information at this point. So where do I stand on the MUU, salad bar, horseshoe theory, insert label here debate? So I obviously agree that there are distinct grievances and narratives that drive people to adopt extreme beliefs or to act violently in some cases. But I would argue that while we have seen what appears to be relative increases in the convergence of narratives, of causes, of aesthetics, of tactics, most of these narratives, causes, aesthetics, and tactics are born from a fundamentally reactionary worldview. And that got a little overzealous there. Okay, so Alex and Mustafa's report does touch on this, I think, in a really meaningful way. In the report and in the panel thus far, they've argued that the nature of this mixing of ideologies is not random or incoherent. They both share, referring to the two belief systems, similar reactionary and virulently anti-liberal politics and an interest in the unraveling of liberalism around the world. I absolutely agree with that broader notion, but I'm just going to take this opportunity rather to just repeat what they said to provide you all with a framework through which I view these issues in my work on a day-to-day basis, because maybe mixed, unclear, or uncertain ideologies is a misnomer, or maybe it's conceptually flawed. Who's to say we'll be having this debate for years to come? But ultimately, my argument is that I think hyper-focusing on the granular ideology categorization and labeling might actually be missing the forest for the trees a bit, especially for those of us doing monitoring for the purposes of threat detection and analysis. So before I dive in further, I want to level set a little bit. When I'm talking about reactionaries, I'm talking about anyone who is driven by a desire to preserve power, to preserve this mythical hierarchy or lifestyle of decades or centuries past. Reactionaries tend to believe that any advancement by an outgroup is an existential threat to their status in society or to their way of life. Reactionaries love positioning themselves as under attack or as being oppressed or persecuted in some way, even though they are often the ones doing the majority of the oppression and the persecution. Therefore, reactionaries adopt whatever narrative, whatever conspiracy theory, really whatever cause enables them to justify defending the existing hierarchy again against what they view as kind of this progressive insurgency. And that insurgency tends to be composed of movements by historically oppressed groups simply attempting to achieve some iota of equity in society. And so Jason Stanley wrote in his book, How Fascism Works, that those who benefit from hierarchy will adopt a myth of their own superiority, which will occlude basic facts about social reality. And a lot of reactionary talking points, propaganda, and among more mainstream reactionaries, policy proposals and legislation stem from this occlusion of basic facts about social reality. And we see that across reactionary belief systems and these notions of racial and cultural supremacy on a global scale, which obviously my fellow panelists have talked about today. It's not just relegated to my area of expertise, which is the far right, specifically in the US. So, to that point, Mustafa actually wrote about this to some degree alongside Marc-Andre Argentino and Emmy Conley in their January 2022 report for ICSR and Insight. If you haven't given it a read, I highly recommend it. So the ICSR report explored the syncretism between neo-fascist accelerationists and Salafi jihadists. And both of these movements find common cause in their support for natural hierarchy, racial and cultural supremacy, traditional family, anti-Semitism, anti-modernism, and anti-government sentiment. And also, I just realized, Mustafa, sorry, that wasn't you. I just know we've talked about this a lot. I realized that you did not actually co-author that report. That's my bad. We just talk about this all the time. Okay, so with that, I don't think it's a hot take to argue that these seemingly discrete grievances or beliefs serve as pillars that uphold this bigger reactionary ideology, and the people who hold reactionary beliefs do so because they view power in society as a zero-sum game. So now that you've had to look at 4 slides of straight text, here's an artistic rendering of what I've built here, which is the House of Reactionary. Extremism isn't funny, but my lacking artistic ability is, so feel free to make fun of this. Please don't screenshot it or use it ever. These pillars are beliefs or grievances that, like I mentioned previously, can seem discrete, but often have actually quite a bit of overlap. So we can have a racial supremacy pillar, a misogyny pillar, an anti-Semitism pillar, et cetera. And I think sometimes exploring these pillars as almost discrete ideologies can be beneficial when understanding an individual's radicalization pathway, the online subcultures they inhabit, the tactics, techniques, or procedures, or TTPs, a given group or movement or individual uses in offline spaces. But sometimes I think that viewing all of these people as simply reactionary may be more effective in countering them, which I'll speak about more in a bit. But bottom line up front, I think the nuance these pillars provide can be helpful, but also can be potentially harmful, or at least detrimental. Because ultimately, these pillars typically aren't that discrete. I imagine most misogynists also believe in hierarchy and traditional family and a mythic past, for example. Of course, there's still nuance, obviously, like someone can be anti-LGBTQ, but not be anti-Semitic, and they would still qualify as reactionary, in my view. All caveats apply, of course. But I think a key reason we're seeing this convergence of narratives, of aesthetics, of tactics, is because of the repetition born from all of these beliefs being fundamentally reactionary in nature. So in her statement for the record for the January 6th committee, Professor Leslie Honor wrote that repetition of certain symbols, phrases, and even memes create the conditions for radicalization. And I think that's very true. I think we're seeing that time and time again. When you hear that your voice is being silenced, that your people are under attack, your jobs are being taken away from you, that your people are the ones who built this nation and now your people are second-class citizens. And you hear that when you turn on your TV, when you go on Twitter or X, or when you listen to a politician's speech, or when you log onto an online forum to discuss something completely unrelated, you're seeing it everywhere. And these discussions are happening in all of these spaces and beyond because they're all buying into that reactionary playbook. So of course, people are going to start internalizing that message because they see it everywhere. It's been completely legitimized and normalized. So the pillars that hold up the house of reactionary are really, in my view, kind of seemingly discrete spoonfuls of sugar that kind of make the holistic reactionary worldview go down a bit smoother. So here's my framework of choice. Cynthia Miller-Idris and Brian Hughes introduced the framework of mobilizing concepts in a piece they did for Lawfare back in 2021. I don't think I can send the link in the chat, but it's called Blurry Ideologies and Strange Coalitions, the Evolving Landscape of Domestic Extremism. And frankly, for my work day to day, I like this framework better than discussions of ideology. And I know this is, of course, where I diverge a bit from some folks in the field, but when it comes to what my job is and what I'm responsible for, I, in a lot of scenarios, don't actually care why you're showing up armed at a drag brunch. I don't care if you think it's because drag queens are trying to groom your children, which of course is a very popular narrative, or if you just hate the LGBTQ community writ large. I care about impact. I care about the fact you're showing up armed to a drag brunch and intimidating people because they live a life that you, for whatever reason, view as an existential threat. You're causing harm in that scenario. And so again, impact over intent is what I kind of care about in these offline manifestations as well. And that also applies to January 6th as well. I don't really care why you beat up a cop within an inch of his life for doing his job and preventing you from entering the Capitol and trying to kill members of Congress. I don't really care if you were there because you're a Christian nationalist or because you hate Nancy Pelosi or because your neighbor offered you a ride and you thought it sounded fun. What I care about is, again, you caused harm, impact over intent. And I think as a lot of these online threats manifest in offline spaces, maybe we should be adopting this framework to look at those threats. Or both, but this is just my framework. So building upon that, most of my analysis that I do is done through this lens of existential threat language and apocalyptic language and weaponized victimhood, more so than necessarily the reactionary ideology. Because granted, these are kind of the rhetorical tools that reactionaries use, but this is kind of the existential threat framing that causes people to actually act. The things that people in the US specifically have mobilized around: Stop the Steal obviously culminated in January 6th. And obviously that narrative has legs and is still ongoing today. We see the groomer narratives targeting the LGBTQ community, and there are anti-LGBTQ demonstrations and protests I would say virtually every weekend at this point. Parents' rights groups showing up at school board meetings and also anti-LGBTQ events. All of it centers the outgroup, these perceived outgroups, as an existential threat to the safety and success of the in-group. And so by positioning themselves as victims, a lot of these reactionary groups and movements and individuals can justify pretty much any and all action that they take as self-defense. And acting in self-defense when you're protecting yourself or your loved ones, everything you hold dear, isn't just justified, it's necessary. Go to the next slide. Some additional examples of this. Every shooter who has invoked white genocide or the Great Replacement theory, they claim that there's been an invasion, that, so they have to protect their people. In all of those cases, it's been white people. Very specifically, the El Paso shooter wrote in his manifesto, and I quote, "They are the instigators, not me. I'm simply defending my country from cultural and ethnic replacement brought on by the invasion." That is peak weaponized victimhood. It's that self-defense framing. And of course, we see it in the Turner Diaries, where white people are being persecuted by the US government and people of color. They use it to justify race war. Cesar Sayoc, his court filing literally read that he began to consider Democrats as not just dangerous in theory, but imminently and seriously dangerous to his personal safety. The lieutenant in the Coast Guard who was arrested, and I'm quoting the DOJ press release here, he intended to exact retribution on minorities and those he considers traitors. So a lot of this kind of what actually mobilizes people to act, it's all about protecting their own and punishing enemies for ever having dared trying to take what you view as yours. So here's where it gets a little complicated and workshopping this, but I think the buckets that people tend to place extremist beliefs into, whether, anti-government extremists, violent misogynists, etc. I think that's actually most helpful when discussing TTPs. But I think if we're talking about the pretty jarring level of co-radicalization and collaboration and co-mobilization happening among reactionaries in pursuit of generally shared goals, especially within the domestic, extremist landscape here in the US, I think it can be helpful to view them as maybe just reactionaries writ large. And I think an example of that is, we had a Gays Against Groomers chapter show up at the same Pride event in Watertown, Wisconsin as Blood Tribe members. And Gays Against Groomers, you guys may have seen it, they issued a press release afterwards. They left early and they were apparently aghast that neo-Nazis would show up, but and align themselves with them. But, the propaganda in the lead up to the Watertown Pride event and the ensuing, anti-LGBTQ demonstration, the Gays Against Groomers chapter and, Blood Tribe and Goyim Defense League, these entities that were all trying to recruit people to show up to protest the Pride event, they were all using the same exact narratives. So there was that narrative convergence, that dog whistle, that coded language convergence. And so sometimes, that those pillars, that added nuance actually enables reactionary groups to try to distance themselves from other reactionary groups, even though they're using the same exact narratives and the same exact language, and the impact is the same. They both showed up to intimidate the LGBTQ community. So that's where kind of zooming out can be helpful in those scenarios. And of course, here I talked about some examples of tactical convergence, where we have, various groups adopting the Proud Boys chapter-based tactics, Proud Boys adopting hate groups, mainstreamization tactics. Now Proud Boys are, showing up at school board meetings and whatnot. We have January 6th defendants who have adopted the criminal defense tactics used by sovereign citizens in the past. And ultimately, we are seeing kind of this broader convergence. That said, and here's where I'm going to add, zoom back in and make this probably a little confusing, which I said is why I'm workshopping it. Placing everyone in that same reactionary bucket when analyzing what tactics they'll use, or even in some cases what targets they do mobilize against, sometimes it does help to consider what pillar the group or movement or individual is prioritizing, which ultimately is why I like the mobilizing concepts framework better than kind of these granular categorizations of ideology. So for example, sovereign citizens aren't necessarily showing up at Pride events, for example, which tends to be a mobilizing concept for a lot of these groups, these broader reactionary groups and movements and individuals. They're motivated by anti-government views more than anything else. So do they, of course, buy into some aspects of, the QAnon conspiratorial belief system, among other conspiracy theories? Absolutely. But for them, mobilizing against the LGBTQ community is not really a priority. It's not like the key pillar that holds up their reactionary belief system. And same goes for the Oath Keepers, which obviously are all but defunct. But they're actually a pretty compelling case study here, because I know a lot of people are like, well, they're white supremacists, they're racist, they're anti-Semitic. A lot of them for sure are. But when it comes to how they actually mobilized offline in the years before January 6th, they were acting like an anti-government group. They weren't acting necessarily like other groups that are mobilized primarily by their white supremacy. So this is where, the nuance makes it a little more confusing. So with the Oath Keepers, of course, they may have learned from other reactionary groups and movements and adopted some of those techniques, but the actions that they took were largely different. Of course, they weren't necessarily, demonstrating outside of synagogues or tearing down a flag in front of a Black Lives Matter flag in front of a Black church in Washington, D.C., for example. So I would say let's ensure we're keeping the nuance in discussion, which is that these groups, movements, and individuals may largely reside in this house of reactionary that I drew for you all earlier, but the discrete pillars that mobilize them, I think, are what distinguish them in terms of the tactics, techniques, and procedures that they embrace. Not always, obviously, because the aforementioned trending, towards convergence within the reactionary landscape, but it's worth keeping in mind. So, as I said, my opinion is that the mobilizing concepts framework is the best for analyzing actual threats in real time that may unfold. I think there are, of course, exceptions to the rule of increased convergence, but that is largely what we're trending toward. And because we are seeing a pretty substantial convergence under kind of this reactionary worldview, and the groups and movements and individuals who are holding up the different pillars to keep the house of reactionary standing, they are all under the same roof, eating the same meals, they're bedfellows. Because a lot of the times they're able to look past their differences to pursue their shared reactionary goals. And that's where we see the kind of mass mobilization that's most concerning to national security and to, violence prevention and actually causing harm. And so, my argument is that mobilizing concepts is a better framework because it enables us to focus on impact over intent, especially for those of us who are monitoring threats in real time. And with that, I will close out.
Thanks, Megan. That was very useful. So good to have a kind of opposing or certainly different approach to ours for the audience to consider. I think you build on the question of the reactionary, the underlying reactionary nature of the politics, and of course it's something, as you quoted from the report, is something we touch on. But I think it's interesting to look instead at the ideology, which we look at more, which is the mobilizing concepts. I think that probably be interesting to see how those two things are connected as well. But definitely a good perspective to have. So we had a few questions come in. If you wanted to add a question to the Q&A pane, you have a couple minutes. We'll probably go a little bit over time. I'll read out a couple of these questions. The first one, I guess, is for all of us. How can practitioners address conspiracy theories that facilitate radicalization without playing into pre-existing conspiratorial beliefs? Which is the kind of classic conundrum, I suppose, if that's the right usage of that term here, which has been in CV for a long time, is how do you not make things worse or kind of confirm the fears of the people you're trying to reach? So it's a good question, hard one to answer. I think what I would say, certainly from, I think the US is probably one of the better ones in terms of transparency, but I think transparency is probably the most obvious answer. It's kind of being as open with the public as possible about what you're doing and how you're doing it. The US is probably a leader in that in the Western world, but more could be done, and certainly in Europe, a lot more transparency. I don't know if Megan or Mustafa wanted to add anything to that.
Megan? I'll take a stab at this. I really actually think one of the better things is how one of the things we can ask ourselves, or if you're a practitioner in that space, is how do you tell the story as captivating as a conspiracy? And again, there are a number of underlying factors there that you're dealing with. I'm not saying that if you can tell a better story, you're going to beat out conspiracists. I'm just saying that there is a lore. There is a lore that builds off of a given conspiracy. There's a certain sort of aesthetic. I think typically what we've tried to do is say, look, here are the conspiracy theories you might hear about a given a given topic, or essentially trying to pre-bunk it from taking hold. And there's been some promise in some of the research around that. However, I still think we are leagues behind the ability to captivate an audience like a conspiracy theory ultimately does. I mean, we have an entire movie that's dedicated to the aliens building the pyramids. As an Egyptian, is Stargate, and as an Egyptian, I find it reprehensible. But at the end of the day, it's also part of a conspiracy theory that there's no way that humans could have built that, right? And it takes away from a certain given history. And so I really think we need to just get better at telling stories and how we tell those stories.
Yes, I mean, it may be something that's very difficult to achieve, because the whole point of the conspiracy theory is that it's telling a story, and usually stories don't, are easy to follow, don't require much, of your own research or level of knowledge, and in fact, I write in other places the importance of the storyteller in any kind of radicalization, pathways. That the best recruiters, the best preachers are the ones who are the storytellers. Their training, their background, their religious knowledge is really second to their ability to take all the say in Islam, the hadith, and make a story out of it for a specific audience. That's what really matters. And so in the end, these non-state kind of actors, they're probably always going to have a one-up on the state, because their version is always going to be kind of easier to it's designed to be easier to grasp and make sense more, and doesn't require a huge amount of knowledge on the side of the consumer. Stargate reference is great. I hope it's not lost on too many people, given the when that film was made. Now, I didn't even put together the connection between that and the Egyptians and the aliens built the pyramids conspiracy theory. Of course, that's what it's kind of hooked on. Okay, a couple more questions. This is an interesting one. I don't have a good answer for it. I don't know if some of you do it. There's research emerging on this. Is there a way to anticipate when online discussions move to offline violence? I think, Megan, that might be something that's relevant to the work you did at the committee.
Absolutely. That's a great question. And I know that this is something that increasingly those of us who do monitoring and are monitoring, for these threats, and trying to, discern between shit posting, for lack of a better word, and genuine threats. It's not exactly a finely tuned art just yet. It's kind of like a, when you see it kind of vibe. But I think there's a few things to keep in mind. I will actually point to where Mustafa works, ISD. They put out a field guide to kind of that provides some, basic steps essentially to determine whether a threat is credible or viable or not. And ultimately, like, some of the key takeaways there, I would say, would be the fact that, like, generally, if they're like specific, so obviously in the lead up to January 6th, where people were posting maps of the tunnels underneath the Capitol, they were sharing links to Discord channels so they could move, their planning into more clandestine or closed and secure spaces. That kind of shift from just general, like, let's start a civil war, or like, I'm going to kill so-and-so, indicates, like, they actually mean it. And I think it's also worth noting that in the case of mass shooters, they don't really post threats beforehand because they don't want to get caught. They don't want to be stopped because they have a mission that they think they have to execute, and that has typically required a lot of planning on their part. And so really, like, when it comes to those are a lot harder to detect ahead of time, because they just usually release their manifesto moments or, like, moments before the attack is happening. And so it just depends if we're talking about, mass mobilization or kind of these lone actors, for lack of a better term. But I think specificity of the threat is key in determining whether something's credible.
Yeah, that's very useful. I think it's a good question, because it's definitely the question that a lot of people are asking right now in both kind of counterintelligence, counterterrorism, and in the kind of analysis world. You'd imagine that particularly AI will be quite a useful tool, but also you'd imagine a lot of controversy around the kind of application of software or tools on people's data and their activities online before they do something, in order to kind of determine if they're gonna. There are some kind of dystopian, I guess, connotations there for some, as with a lot of the CVE work, right? Just final question that we have here, kind of general question on how should we expect to see ideological syncretism continue to evolve in 2024 and beyond? Will we see a continued merging between these subcultures, continued mainstreaming of some of this? Very hard to predict. I think one of the things that we haven't touched on too much, we have a little bit, is the role anti-Semitism plays in kind of gluing a lot of this together. One of the main things that attracts a lot of these different groups is the kind of almost, very wide, if not almost mainstream belief that Jews have a kind of outsized power and influence and control of a nefarious type. So I would expect that to remain consistent. Beyond that, though, I think you'll find that, the interest of different groups will depend on, what kind of, on the anti-Semitism thing, by the way, it's worth noting the White House as well. It's now developed its own task force on this specifically, having obviously identified this as something that cuts through a lot of the extremist groups, something to keep an eye on. I have other things to say on it, but because we're going on over time, I'll give Mustafa or Megan a chance if they want to have a go at predicting.
I don't really want to predict anything because, as we know, that usually results in someone going, "Oh, you got owned" at the end of the day. So I do think that these communities will continue, at least online, will continue to sort of grow and splinter. I mean, that's what we've seen over the past few years, is that you've got an increasing sort of convergence around aesthetics and content, but also you have ideological intra-group fights that are taking place that are creating these new groups, right? They're ultimately the same group under different branding. And I mean, when I look at Megan's sort of message house diagram, that right there keeps them together. However, they're ultimately also trying to differentiate each other from each other, because it is a part of marketing 101. How do you market yourself in an extremist milieu versus how do you market yourself to a more mainstream audience? And there is actually, if you look at the way that Telegram and Discord groups function within these communities, they function as more of the harder content, sort of, this is where I'm going to dox a judge dealing with an Islamic State case, versus on Twitter or Facebook, where I'm going to sort of post things that have already been shared in the public space, that haven't been moderated, that still reflect my worldview. So there's even a split there in how they're operating across platforms. So yes, I think these groups will continue to splinter. I think they will grow in some sense, and you're going to see a lot more of sort of the convergence under that message house that Megan talked about. Those are the primary pillars, if you will, of a lot of these groups that are labeled mixed or hybrid, and will continue to be. And yes, you can chalk them up to just some of it being pure just tradition or conservatism within some communities, but they're also being leveraged by extremists that claim allegiances to noted and prescribed terrorist groups.
Thanks, Mustafa. Any last comments, Megan? Okay, great.
No, I think Mustafa nailed it. Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks again to Megan Conroy of the Atlantic Council, Mustafa Ayad, the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. Thanks also to the audience for tuning in and sticking with us, even though we've gone over the time. I can see a lot of you hung in there. Thanks for the questions. This has been recorded. You can see it on our YouTube page, which is the YouTube page at Program on Extremism. On Twitter, you can find us GWUPOE, or online extremism.gwu.edu. Thanks again. And I'm sure we'll see you all again soon.